You're weaker than your father. Not an opinion, not a judgment. It's measurable scientific fact. It's not your fault. The question is, how did this happen? Where did the instruction manual for male resilience go? The answer isn't pills or plastic. It's culture. Specifically, what Hollywood spent 4 decades doing to an entire generation. Let's talk about it. In 1985, the average British or American male aged 20 to 34 could apply 117 pounds of grip strength. Just 31 years later, by 2016, that had dropped to 98 pounds. That's a 20% loss of raw physical power in a single generation. You're literally weaker than your dad was at your age. Not by a little, by a fifth. And your dad was weaker than his grandfather, both physically and mentally. But that's just what you can see. What's happening inside is even worse. Male testosterone has been plummeting by approximately 1% per year since the 1980s. A 65-year-old man in 2002 had testosterone levels 15% lower than a 65-year-old in 1987. And before you blame aging, this isn't natural, it's generational degradation. The entire male population is chemically retreating. Recent studies from Israel confirm the trend has continued into 2025, a 10% decline between 2006 and 2019 alone. Your son will have less testosterone than you. Your grandson will have less than your son. We're watching a multi-generational biological cascade. And then there's reproduction. Sperm counts in Western men have declined by over 50% since the 70s. We're not talking about being a bit soft around the edges anymore. We're watching the male reproductive system collapse in real time. Now, some of this may well be environmental. Plastics, microplastics, processed food, sedentary lifestyles, hunched over screens. But here's what nobody wants to discuss. The training for male strength has vanished. Boys don't climb trees. They don't roughhouse. They're not tested. And the cultural models that showed them what resilience looks like, these have been systematically dismantled, and by one institution in particular. Let me show you something about how media shapes men. The 1980s and the 1990s, the competent Stoic. John McClane in Die Hard doesn't say, "I'm afraid." He climbs up a building with no shoes and says, "Yippee-ki-yay." The strength isn't in processing his feelings, it's in action. The message was simple. Competence protects people. Emotion is private. Duty is public. And that was the cultural father figure. The man your father was supposed to become. In the 2000s and 2010s, the bumbling man-child came into being. That's when something shifted. Knocked Up gives us Seth Rogen, a man-child who's literally managed by Katherine Heigl. He's not flawed in an interesting way, he's just incompetent. The joke isn't that he struggles, it's that he's a useless adult who needs parenting. Daddy got stupid. Sitcoms then followed. The father figure went from Mike Brady, authority, wisdom, to Homer Simpson. He just became a punchline. And then to people like Tim the Toolman Taylor or Phil Dunphy from Modern Family, even Hal from Malcolm in the Middle. The trend is clear. The wise dad becomes the fool, and then the fool becomes the default. Boys were watching, they were learning. I want to be acceptable. I can't be like that. And then we get to the male leads who open scenes now by discussing their trauma with a therapist. They save the day while processing their vulnerability. Modern film theory explicitly celebrates subverting the alpha male and presents traditional Stoicism as a sickness to be cured. Recent industry analysis from 2025 shows Hollywood continues pushing softness, celebrating thin, fragile bodies, emotional availability over physical capability, sensitivity over decisiveness. The message is unambiguous. Traditional masculinity is dangerous. The new masculinity is therapy speak and tears. Here's where it gets sinister. There's a psychological principle called cultivation theory. This isn't controversial. This is peer-reviewed and in mainstream psychology. The research is solid. Long-term exposure to media messages shape how people see reality. And here's the mechanism. A boy watches his father figure get mocked on screen for being dominant or stoic. He watches the sensitive guy get the girl. He watches the alpha male revealed to be insecure and toxic. Over 10,000 hours of Netflix. Across his teens and 20s. His brain doesn't philosophize about this. It absorbs it. And what does he do? He becomes the guy on screen who's acceptable, passive, emotionally incontinent, indecisive. Not because it's who he is, but because it's the only version of manhood he's seen that gets rewarded. This isn't accidental. The director isn't making art here. The screenwriter isn't exploring masculinity. The studio is re-educating an entire generation away from traditional norms. And it's working. And then, this is where the real damage becomes visible. The mental strength of Western males, what psychologists call resilience, the internal locus of control, and Stoic emotional regulation has all demonstrably atrophied. Dr. Jean Twenge conducted a massive meta-analysis spanning decades. Her findings? Young people today are significantly more likely to have an external locus of control than in the 1960s. And translating that to normal speak means modern men believe they're helpless victims of circumstance rather than captains of their own destiny. That's not weakness, that's learned helplessness, where complaining about the system replaces overcoming the obstacle, where victimhood becomes your identity. Now, society's been pushing a narrative. Open up. Share your feelings. Vulnerability is strength. Sounds progressive, right? Here's the problem. It doesn't work. Despite decades of telling men to discuss mental health, to open up, to be vulnerable, male suicide rates haven't improved. They've increased. Male suicidal thoughts have worsened. The 2025 State of American Men report found that men experiencing economic insecurity are 16 times more likely to report suicidal thoughts. Adherence to what the researchers call the man box, that's the traditional masculinity norm, that makes men 6 times more likely to report suicidal ideation. That's a big difference. And here's the rub. Over 50% of men report that no one really knows me, even though they're supposedly opening up more than previous generations. So we seem to have the strategy backwards. Research on rumination, and that's not cows chewing the cud, it's constantly replaying emotional pain, which is what modern therapy culture encourages, actually increases anxiety and depression. But here's what does work. Stoic training, emotional regulation through discipline rather than rumination. Studies have shown it reduces anxiety, reduces rumination, and increases self-efficacy. The old strategies worked. The new strategy is broken. And instead of admitting the strategy failed, we're blaming men. You know what evolutionary psychology actually shows about male vulnerability? Excessive vulnerability in men signals incompetence or instability. It triggers social rejection, which fuels the very depression that opening up was supposed to cure. So we've created a trap. Tell men to be vulnerable, watch them get rejected, blame them for not being vulnerable enough. That's not therapy. That's systematic incapitation. This isn't just about individual men anymore. This is institutional collapse. 85% of youth in prison grew up in fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless backgrounds. When Hollywood removes the cultural father figure, the wise, protective, decisive male, and replaces him with either a bumbling idiot or an emotionally incontinent wreck, what message do boys get? That there's no one to become. Boys need models. They need models for how to turn aggression into protection, how to harness ambition into provision, how to be needed. When every father on screen is either a punchline or a disaster, boys internalize one lesson: masculinity is broken. And then there's the military, the institution that's literally built on testing male capability and building resilience. The military now rejects 77% of young applicants. The majority are disqualified for mental and behavioural health reasons. Just think about that. The place where we historically proved men could handle pressure, could handle discipline, and real consequences is running out of men who can pass the test to even get in. That's not a recruiting problem. That's a socialisation crisis. We've removed the training ground for resilience and then act shocked when men can't handle adversity. And finally, there's employment. Male employment has dropped from 80% to 69% during the 1980s. We shifted from being a manufacturing economy, which valued physical strength, decisiveness, and problem solving, to a service economy valuing soft skills and emotional labour. The male body suddenly became economically obsolete. And what does Hollywood do and still do? It mocks this. It celebrates the displacement of the traditional provider as progress. So we've systematically dismantled every institution that trained men: the family structure, the media models, the job market, the military, and then we're confused why men are broken. Here's what we've actually got: measurably weaker bodies, chemically depleted hormones, psychologically fragile minds, and a media apparatus that spent 4 decades systematically redefining what it means to be a man. This isn't progress. This is calculated damage. And we'll go back. The traditional male role requires a high internal locus of control. It means I am responsible for my life, for protecting my family, for solving problems. But the modern woke male role encourages external locus of control. I am a victim of my trauma. I am a victim of my circumstances. I am systematically oppressed. The first creates builders, the second creates dependents. Now, I'm not saying that men shouldn't have emotions, or that we should go back to bottling everything up like in the 1950s, but there's a massive difference between emotional intelligence and emotional incontinence. There's a difference between strength with compassion and weakness masquerading as sensitivity. Mental strength, like physical strength, requires resistance to build. You don't get strong muscles by removing all friction. You get fragile ones. The same with resilience. When you remove risk, challenge, and expectation from a boy's life, you don't get enlightened men. You get fragile adults who shatter when life gets hard. And we are watching this happen. The data is clear. The decline is real. And every man watching this knows it in his bones. He can feel the pressure to shrink, the message that his strength is toxic, the weight of being told his competence is a liability, that his desire to protect is controlling, that his drive to lead is patriarchal. You didn't ask for it, but you're living it. The system is deliberately breaking men by removing the framework that teaches resilience, and it's working. If you're tired of pretending it's fine, if you want the uncomfortable truth without the HR department's permission, hit subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it but can't say it all by himself without being labelled. There's a whole audience of men and women who care about them, who are watching the collapse and wondering, what the hell happened? I'm Sergeant Grumpy. This is the channel where uncomfortable truths get unpacked with evidence, not ideology. I'll see you in the next one.